Hi, and welcome to Breakup Bites. I'm Jennifer Barkin, and here's my colleague, Jennifer Donison. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. So, today we're going to talk about a topic that affects really anyone divorcing with children called child support.
Yes, and it's such an important topic to touch on because a lot of people don't understand how much child support is going to be entitled to receive or pay. And I'm sure you do too, Jennifer, get a lot of clients that come to us and say, "Well, how much do I have to pay?" And I'm paying this already. Is that okay? And it's something that we don't know until we see a broader disclosure for finances. And
Mhm.
it's something that I think that we should explain to people so that they understand where we're coming from.
Agreed. So, child support is really, um, in most cases, the one thing that cannot be negotiated. Child support in this province is considered the rights of the children. And that means it's not for moms or dads to make up a number of what that amount of child support will be. It's funny because I had somebody say to me last week, I'm paying $500 to her every month. And my response to that is, unless I've run the software, unless I've seen um, both of your income, I have to know the schedule of the children because anything over 60% time with one parent makes them the recipient of the child supports. But I don't know, and you don't know what that child support payment is until we utilize the software, the same ones that the lawyers use or the courts use. It's called DivorceMate. And we basically input information. So a misconception that people have on child support is, well, if I'm a child support payer, my child support is covering all the needs of the children. But guess what? It's not. Your child support was designed to cover just three things, and that is food, shelter, and clothing. Now, you're a mom, and I'm a mom, so what do we know? Children need more than just food, shelter, and clothing. So there's sort of an extra type of child support, is how I'm going to describe it. Interchangeably, it's known as Section 7 expenses or extraordinary expenses for children. So, what is included? Well, maybe health items that do not fall under OHIP. So, things like orthodontics, therapy for children, um, eyeglasses, um, things like that. So not everybody has insurance, or maybe the insurance doesn't cover the whole expense. So that's an extraordinary expense. Education, and under education falls daycare expenses, college, university, and typically most agreements will say that it goes till the end of the first degree. So those costs are allocated between the parents as Section 7 expenses. And then sometimes it could be the extracurricular activities. So, the extracurricular activities, for example, we may look at, did these occur during the marriage? Because if there hasn't been a material change or a change in financial circumstances, these should continue. Um, and sometimes, if a child is very, very young when the parents are separated, these are things that can be discussed in litigation or in mediation, what these Section 7 expenses should be, maybe swim classes or gymnastics or ballet, whatever, whatever. So those extras are not falling under the regular child support. Again, child support is food, shelter, and clothing for children. And I'll add that child support does not mean, when you say food, that we're taking the kids to the keg once a week or whatever restaurant. It means good food, good healthy food in their tummies, right? So that the children are nourished. It doesn't mean designer clothes like, I don't know if you have one of these, they want Uggs and they want Canada Goose and all those label. Absolutely not. It means a warm winter coat and a pair of boots that fit.
Well, that was a lot of information and also great for everyone to understand. And so, just to break it down, when determining child support, there's going to be more than just a number that's thrown out. We are definitely going to need financials so that we can understand what is appropriate. And it depends on many different things, as you've touched on. And another thing is if the parenting time is not shared parenting, that could also affect the amount of child support that is actually going to be accurate and appropriate for the situation. And then moving on to extraordinary expenses, that is separate from child support. And one of the things that is important to understand also is that for those expenses for Section 7, there's usually a split that's determined. So it's
Mhm.
not always 50-50. It depends on the income, again, for both parents and what it is that the split may be. Could be 30-70, it could be 50-50, it could be 90-10. It just depends on the situation.
It depends on the differences in the parents' incomes. Now, one thing I'd like to add to that is whatever agreement is drawn up today, that child support doesn't stay the same. Going back to child support is the rights of the child. It's always on the most current gross income. It's always calculated on the most current gross income tax return. So what this means is, and you'll see this in agreements, professionally done agreements, not kitchen table agreements, is once a year the parents are going to exchange their tax returns and notices of assessment for child support purposes. And why is that? Because let's say last year one parent was earning 50 and the other was earning 40, but on the latest tax return now they're earning 70, or this person, is earning a little bit more over here. So whatever the child support is always recalculated so that it's always on the most current incomes and kept up to date, which makes a lot of sense because if you think about it, let's say you separated from your spouse or partner 6 years ago, and think of inflation and and now they're earning more, and all of a sudden, um, you know,
Yeah.
nothing has changed. Or vice versa. Let's say, okay, we came out of COVID. Somebody lost their job in COVID and they found a job close to what they were making, but not exactly what they were making after COVID. Um, Maybe the child support number has gone down a little bit, right? So it,
Yeah, and people who are self-employed, it fluctuates all the time for a lot of self-employed individuals. And one thing that I want to share, and I want Jennifer, maybe you to explain this a little bit for our viewers, is why is it so important for people to not determine their own child support that they need to pay or receive, and not have it in a professionally done agreement? What are the risks of not having a professional determine the proper support?
So it's funny. I see this a lot, and I'm sure you see this a lot too. I actually had somebody last week saying to me, "Well, I pay her $500 a month, so I am paying child support." And then my question is, "And where did you get this amount from?" Well, it's amount we decided. So going back to, no, it's not for the parents to decide. We have to follow what the child support advisory guidelines state.
And
Those
what
are the rules. I don't make the rules, but here they are.
right.
And the danger of not following the guidelines is what's allowed is retroactive support payments. So for this person who's been paid $500 a month, let's say for this year the proper amount was 865, and let's say going back for last year it was 925. Well, that can be calculated as retroactive support, and somebody gets a little sticker shock because they're going to have a retroactive support payment. So we don't recommend figuring out your own support. Some people will say, well, I can go online to mysupportcalculator.ca, um, but it's a pretty basic calculator. So it's best to have a professional who has access to proper software work it out for you.
Hmm. Absolutely. And, the last thing that I will ask for our viewers to understand is when they come to mediation and they want to have the proper child support determined, what actual documents do they have to have prepared for us?
So I'm going to speak to people that are employed because they're quite easy. They have a tax return and a notice of assessment. They've done their taxes. And we look at the gross income, and that is the number that we input. Where it can get a little bit trickier in mediation and in litigation,
Mhm.
self-employed people, because um, what's a business expense?
Right.
Finding out the true income for child support. Um, as a mediator, that's not my job to do. Um, Typically, it might be an accountant that might figure it out. If they're in mediation, I might ask the parties, why don't you get a neutral accountant so that they have no vested interest? Because if my accountant versus your accountant, my accountant's going to get my number low, your accountant's going to get the number high, right? So maybe use a neutral
Mhm.
accountant. Um,
Mhm. And
if
in my experience, when people are self-employed and they may have done a few things to try and save on taxes and maybe pull less money than they're making or write off expenses that aren't necessarily for their business, they want to try to come to a number determined with their other spouse because they don't want to have a forensic accountant go into their financial statements and look through everything and to determine what is actually business expenses and what isn't. So it's sometimes easier for people to figure it out together than to rip the whole accounting apart. So that's sometimes a motivator for self employed people
For
as well.
sure. And I'm sure you've seen this before too, where um, the self-employed person. Now, you and I are both self-employed, so we're not coming down on self-employed people.
Oh, of course not.
But I've had where the self-employed person comes to mediation and says that they're earning, and their paperwork is showing $10,000 a year. Well, we know that that number is not correct, because what happens, we might see your Visa bill at averages, let's say $5,000 a month, and it's paid in full every month, and there's no debt, and your rent is $3,500 a month, and your car payment is $1,200 a month. Well, how can you be living this lifestyle,
Right. And
right?
that's it's a very
Again,
good point.
mediators, we will never, ever, ever jump into that. We will might say, help me to understand.
Right. And, if it doesn't make sense, because I have a lot of people that come to me and say, well, my ex is hiding money, or my ex gets paid cash, or my ex is, not paid themselves the proper amount and they are self employed. And, my response is always, well, if it doesn't add up and we're trying to make it make sense and it doesn't, and the other person isn't going to come to the table and try to be fully disclosing their situation, then unfortunately sometimes it does have to be transferred to more of a litigated process, and that's not good for anyone. So people generally want to come to the table and try to negotiate because the alternative is not a pretty one. It will cost them probably more money than they're trying to save.
Exactly. Exactly. So
Yeah.
that's a little bit about child support.
Yep. I hope that this was helpful for people who are curious about it. And our next video will be talking about spousal support. So tune in.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jen.